This is the fifth lecture in our series on value-centered decision making. And this lecture is a little different than the first four lectures. The first four lectures had a bit of math, had some axioms, had some theorems, and it was decision theory coming out of economics. Today we're going to actually look at behavioral economics, and we're going to look at a lot of empirical results of how people actually do make decisions, not in terms of theoretical constructs, but in terms of everyday life and real decision making. We're going to focus on several topics. One is psychological traps. What kinds of things go wrong when you make unaided decisions? And then we're going to talk about 6 classes of models. These lectures have dealt with decision theory, but there's actually 5 other classes, and it's useful to know about them. Then we're going to talk about the nature of expertise and intuition, and when can you trust expertise, when can you trust your intuition? And finally, we're going to talk about organizational perspectives, about organizations making decisions, not just individuals. So psychological traps. What kind of things go wrong? Well, one thing you can have is that you're working on the wrong problem. You come up with an excellent solution, but it's a problem that wasn't the problem, and obviously that doesn't help you. Another is you fail to identify key objectives. You might remember in lecture 1 we talked about lexicographical ordering, where you end up just paying attention to the most important objective. The problem is, of course, the other objectives may have some importance, and you haven't looked at those in full, and so you end up with a problem. Another is you fail to develop a good range of creative alternatives. One of the most creative alternatives that people often overlook is do nothing, the status quo. Don't buy a car, don't buy a house. And often that's very compelling. It's inexpensive, you know how to do it, you already have it. Overlooking crucial consequences of your alternatives. So you buy the dog and you get the dog, but the consequences are you have to train and take care of the dog. There's more consequences than just getting the dog. Giving inadequate thought to trade-offs. So in fact, you don't think about the fact that the attributes have X and Y, but they have a trade-off between them that you need to consider, and you don't pay attention to that. Disregarding uncertainty. So in this case, you have a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, but you don't pay attention to it. You just look at the expected value, you look at the average. That can bite you. Failure to account for your risk tolerance. Not risk tolerance in general, but your particular risk tolerance, how you feel about risk, how you feel about the downside and the upside, etc. And failing to plan ahead when decisions involve multiple consequences. So in lecture 4, we looked at how we partitioned decisions into multiple stages and viewed these as real options. In those cases, you need to look at one decision and how it affects later decisions. Now, Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for his empirical studies of the heuristics and biases that people develop in making decisions. Okay, Amos Tversky was his partner in that work, but he had passed away, so wasn't eligible for the prize. Representativeness. Estimates are based on features of alternatives rather than base rates. So if I ask you what's the odds of a probability of an astronaut walking through the door here versus the probability of a vacuum cleaner salesman, you probably overestimate the probability for the astronaut and underestimate the probability for the vacuum cleaner salesman. Why is that? Because it's very easy to imagine what an astronaut looks like, and it's much more difficult to imagine what a vacuum cleaner salesman looks like. This also relates to availability. They're affected by eases with which examples can be recalled. Anchoring and adjustment. Estimates affected by initial estimates. Okay. So for example, a few years ago, Andy Sage and I were in India and at IEEE conference, and after the meeting, we had a few hours, we decided to buy silk rugs. We went to the vendors, and I looked at a rug that I wanted to buy, and I did eventually buy, and asked him the price, and he said $1,500. So I turned to Andy and I said, Andy, would you pay $100 for this rug? And he said, I certainly would. And the vendor said, wait a minute, I didn't say $100. And I said, I wasn't talking to you, I was talking to my friend Andy. He said, okay, let me get my brother and a pot of coffee and we'll sit and talk about this. So we took an hour or so. I bought the rug for $1,100. Andy then turned to the vendor and said, you made so much money off of him, why don't you give me a good deal on this other one? But the key point is by getting that $100 on the table, I defined a broader range of negotiation than I would have if I hadn't mentioned that number. That's all about anchoring and adjustment. And then finally, motivational bias. Estimates affect the probability. They shouldn't. Your desirability of something shouldn't affect your estimate of it happening. When I was a child, I used to think that if I wished something wouldn't happen, I wouldn't get a particular gift for Christmas or birthday, then it would happen. Okay? The good news there was, even if I was disappointed, I also expected to be disappointed. But that was a case where I was linking probability to the desirability of something. There's also a whole bunch of issues with risk and fears. Okay? So for example, risks and emotion are inseparable. We fear snakes but not cars, but cars are much more likely to do us harm. Few fear skiers risk analysis in predictable ways. We fear spectacular, unlikely events. We fear plane crashes, although we only hear about them very, very rarely. But we don't fear things that happen much more often because they're not spectacular. We underestimate threats that creep up on us. We fear cancer but not heart disease because heart disease happens over a very long time. We prefer, or we think, we can control things. We do not fear pesticide if we're the ones applying it. We substitute one risk for another. We speed up when we put our seatbelts on. In fact, over the years, the last 50 years or so, there's been many safety innovations in cars. And for the most part, what this has resulted is people driving faster. Consequently, the death rate from automobile accidents has not come down anywhere as much as you would expect because of these safety innovations. We use our cortex. Using your cortex isn't always that smart. You can overthink risk. Risk thermostat varies. Gamblers are not always mountain climbers. Okay? Risk arguments cannot be divorced from values. We think drugs are bad and football's fun, but drugs are less dangerous than playing football. Much more likely to get a serious injury from football. We think natural risks are easy to accept. We love being out in the sun, even though we can get skin cancer, but we fear nuclear power because we could potentially get cancer from the radiation. And worrying about risks is risky itself. We can end up fearing fear too much and remembering Winston Churchill's quote during World War II. One of my favorite phenomena is a thing called fundamental attribution error. Now, attribution is how people attribute cause to something, how they answer the question, why did that happen? And here's a good example of what we mean by fundamental attribution error. So if I look at my accomplishments, I think that my successes are due to great skill and effort, and my failures are due to bad luck. However, if I look at your accomplishments, I think your success is due to good luck, and your failure is due to lack of skill and effort. Okay? You see the asymmetry here. So one group views the other group negatively, but there's no real rationale for this. It's just what people psychologically tend to do. One of Malcolm Gladwell's books talks about the role of circumstances. What leads to success? It's intelligence, being smart, hard work and motivation, and circumstances. Okay? Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, for example, ended up leading very successful computer companies because of when they were born and when their computer skills were particularly relevant. And he outlines numerous other examples. There's a classic question, do men make the times or do times make the men? If you study it and look at people like Morgan, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., you'd really have to conclude that men don't make the times, they take advantage of the times. In other words, they understand the circumstances at hand and take advantage of them. Now, one model I developed looking in this arena was based on a book by Richard Niebuhr, a theologian. It was published in 1927. And he has this quote in there, castes make outcasts and outcasts make castes. And the dynamic is very simple. There's a caste, a set of people that are affiliated, and inevitably there are people who don't feel they fit. They may not be cast out physically, but they just feel like they don't fit in that organization. They feel outcast. Over time, these outcasts affiliate, and they start to have a group of their own. And they seek social justice because the caste has treated them poorly. But as they cooperate and work together more, they prosper. Groups that cooperate, that look out for each other, tend to economically prosper, and they actually create a new caste. Now the caste doesn't seek social justice, it seeks salvation because they want justification for all their economic wealth. They want to be chosen special, etc., and have an explanation for why they're so good. Fundamental attribution error comes right in here. Castes feel that their success is due to hard work, not just luck in belonging to a mature caste. Outcasts feel their lack of success is due to the oppression by the mature caste whose success is due to accidents of birth. So you see the asymmetry here. If you look at history over hundreds of years, many millennia, this phenomena of caste and outcast happens again and again and again. Now let's talk about a range of models and theories that come to play here. This semester, for the 4 lectures leading up to this, we focused just on decision theory, which is founded in economics. But there are 5 other choices or other complementary theories. One is behavioral decision theory. Another is psychological decision theory, which became behavioral economics, as I'll explain in a minute. And then in psychology, there's social judgment theory, information integration theory, and attribution theory, which includes the fundamental attribution error that I just talked about. So let's talk about who was involved in these and what was their goal. So Ralph Keeney and Howard Rafer wrote the famous book on multi-attribute utility theory. It's a purple book I used to use in class. And it had so many equations into it, the class referred to it as the purple peril. They're concerned with achieving logical consistency in decision making. For example, being consistent with von Neumann and Morgenstern's axioms of rationality. Ward Edwards from the University of Michigan was really trying to describe and explain departures from optimality, where people really do not behave unaided like decision theory suggests. And the psychological decision theory, Kahneman and Tversky, really focused on the psychological mechanism for why we have these deviations, and this area has come to be known as behavioral economics. Ken Hammond was trying to describe human judgment in social situations, ambiguous situations, and understand what factors were affecting decisions. Norman Anderson was looking at coming up with an algebra, a set of algebraic equations that could explain behavior in social situations. And finally, Jones and Kelly were focused on attribution theory and to describe how humans explain behavior, how they attribute cause, as we just talked about a minute ago. How do these things get used? Well, decision theory is used to aid decision makers, as you've seen from lectures 1 through 4. Behavioral decision theory is used to try to help decision makers to avoid departures from optimality. Psychological decision theory is used to aid decision makers via various mechanisms of debiasing that Kahneman and Tversky have devised. Social judgment theory is used to try to understand the relationship between the judgment and the cues, and it's called policy capturing by Ken Hammond. So a few years ago, when I was head of industrial assistant engineering at Georgia Tech, I had 100 faculty and staff that I had to do annual reviews on. It took me a whole month to do it. And as you might expect, in a university, we had various attributes like number of papers published, student evaluations, proposals funded, PhD students, etc. And I used all this data to make a judgment on the efficacy of each faculty and staff member. When I got done the first time, I took all of these results and put it into a spreadsheet and did a linear regression and tried to figure out what was I weighting to make those decisions. And it turned out, using linear regression, that I was weighting some things much more than I thought I should and others much less. And as a consequence of that policy capturing, I went back and started afresh and did all the reviews over again to try to get it to be more consistent with the values that I thought were important. The other two, information integration theory, was mainly trying to show that the algebra actually fits, that it works, it makes good predictions. And finally, attribution theory, as you know, was to show how humans attribute causes and what kind of errors they have. There are other descriptive models. One's called muddling through. Decisions are just made to assure incremental change. You try to get things to be a little bit better. Satisficing from Herbert Simon, another Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he said people don't really optimize, they satisfice. They come up with answers that are good enough, that are satisfactory. He also worked on bounded rationality, that people are unable, without aiding, to address decisions fully. In other words, what we look at, the material from lectures 1 through 4, people can't just do that in their head without help. Okay. And finally, there's the garbage can model. This is a very interesting model where there's supposedly a garbage can that has a whole bunch of decisions in it, and the group reaches in and picks up a decision and takes it out, and whatever it is, they do it. Now the real interesting part is they then throw the piece of paper back in the garbage can. So what that means is some probability that later on when they reach in the garbage can, they will decide to do the same thing again. Which reminds me of many faculty committee meetings, or at least some faculty committees, where a decision has been made to do something several years ago, no one remembers it, and they decide to do it again. Doesn't seem to make sense, but actually it's not a bad description of what happens. Gary Klein has done numerous seminal studies on whether or not people's intuition and expertise actually leads to good decisions. Does it lead to good or even better decisions than the formal methods we've talked about here? And I want to talk through his view of how people actually approach most of life. So we start off in a situation, we turn the key in our car and it goes click. Okay, we flip the lights on and they're kind of dim. Okay. Those are a set of cues about the car. So we're thinking about what's wrong. They let us recognize a pattern of things that are wrong, and that helps us to decide what we might do. What action scripts might we choose? Now sometimes there might be more than one script. Okay? So there may be many scenarios for why the car won't start. It could be the battery's dead, could be the connections are loose, could be several other things. Okay? Could be a wire is disconnected under the dashboard. Okay, so we have action scripts. Well, which ones do we pursue? We do mental simulation. We think through the implications and what might happen if we pick any one script. And we do that by accessing our mental models. These are mechanisms we have in our head that help us to predict things. When you ride your bicycle and you haven't ridden it all winter, you get on it and ride right away. You don't have to relearn the dynamics of the bicycle. You know it. Same thing with driving your car. Same thing with lots of things. You have mental models that allow you to very efficiently function with those things. And from that we make a decision and we affect the situation by acting, which changes the cues and we go through the cycle again. Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, actually highlights quite a bit of Gary's work quite nicely. And the key is that actually people are pretty good at making decisions intuitively, and experts are certainly very good at making decisions in those contexts for which they are expert. But why doesn't this happen? Why isn't intuition relied upon more? Okay. One is there are organizational policies that require that you document decisions in particular ways and have certain data to justify decisions. Another problem is rapid turnover. Right now in the aerospace and defense industry, for example, it's expected that over the next 10 years, half of the professional staff will retire. And there's a big gap, and then there's people in their 30s and 40s. But the point is the turnover, the expertise walks out the door. Okay? Another fact is the pace of change. So expertise doesn't apply because things have changed so quickly. Decision-making procedures can take the intuition out of it because you have to follow certain rules. Okay? And decision metrics can often be a problem. There's nothing wrong with metrics, but there is something wrong with just using the metrics and calculating the decision rather than using judgment. And of course, information technology can have a huge impact because there's just so much information that you no longer can have intuition about the breadth of stuff that you have at hand. So, how do we balance analysis and intuition? In some sense, how do we balance lectures 1 through 4 and lecture 5 today? When do we rely on these different bodies of knowledge? First of all, you should start with intuition, not analysis. Okay? Think about your problem, talk it through, imagine alternatives. Don't worry about trying to model it or put equations together. Accept the zone of indifference. Don't go for precision that isn't meaningful. Do you really need the answer to 3 decimal places or maybe no decimal places at all? Map out the strengths and weaknesses of your options without attaching numbers, just lists of words. Alternative A is good in these ways and bad in this way, and alternative B is good in these ways and bad in these ways. Just map that out. Use mental simulation to evaluate your options. Just think through what might happen if you pick those options. Okay. Simplify the comparisons, get rid of extraneous or things that aren't too important. Bring the intuition to an outsider. Often when we have an idea, either myself or the research group, we'll take it to somebody else in the discipline and say, does this make sense? And often they'll say, well, it's okay, but you forgot about X. And we say, well, what's X? Okay, obviously the outsider had a big impact on that. And don't try to replace intuitions with procedures. Don't think that you can just capture all knowledge and proceduralize it, because that won't work. So, here's a big question. When do we use lectures 1 through 4 and when do we use lecture 5? Well, if we're in a familiar and frequent situation that we do all the time, just rely on your intuition. You've been there before. You know what the cues are, you know what the patterns are, you know what scripts have worked. Just do it. If you're in an unfamiliar situation, but you will be frequently encountering it, then intuition will develop as long as there's good feedback. In other words, you find out whether you made good choices or not. Without any feedback, of course, it won't get any better because you have no way of knowing whether you made a good choice or not. Familiar and infrequent, you can use intuition and say off-the-shelf analysis. So, for example, you're going to buy a car. You don't buy cars that often. You can use, say, the tools on Edmunds.com, and that'll help you to trade off one car versus another, just off-the-shelf tools. But now when you're in unfamiliar situations that are infrequent, you maybe never have done it before, you may never do it again, and there are very high consequences, then it's time for lectures 1 through 4. You need to think through the problem, think through the attributes, think through the trade-offs, think about how you're going to manage the uncertainty associated with it. And once you think you know what to do, go back to intuition for sanity checks. Over the years, I've worked with 100 companies or so and several thousand senior managers and executives. And often we use our analytic tools to find out what's the best way forward. But I haven't found any case where people are willing to do it, even if it disagrees with their intuition. They will actually step back and try to get a gut sense of, does this really make sense? And that is important even for the most analytically oriented decisions, that you do bring intuition in the end for a sanity check about what you're choosing to do. Now this semester we've talked about economic and technical rationality. Okay? That's not surprising, being here at Stevens with engineers and scientists. Okay? But there are other forms of rationality. Okay? For example, the social rationality, where you're trying to preserve the organization and better it in some ways. This may not mean that you want to do the optimum thing from a technical or economic point of view. This political rationality, where you're trying to balance interests and trying to keep the organization together and trying to make some incremental change. And of course, there's legal rationality, where you're trying to comply with rules that are complex, consistent, precise, and detailed. Now, we haven't looked at these three approaches to rationality this semester during these lectures. However, when you're applying the kind of techniques that we've talked about, you will often encounter decision-making groups that include people with these other aspects of rationality. At first, you might not understand why they disagree with you. But once you begin to see how they're viewing the problem, you can begin to understand how the technical and economic rationality cannot dominate. It has to be balanced against these other sources in order to get things done. So over the years, I've worked with, like I said, about 100 companies and large numbers of decision makers. And one thing that struck me is how organizations delude themselves. They often come up with strategies and plans for organizations that they aren't, or maybe they never were. Examples, Motorola, Nokia, digital equipment, organizations that just faded. And the source of many of this, it seems to me, is delusions. So I wrote a book called Don't Jump to Solutions. Subtitle is 13 Delusions That Undermine Strategic Thinking. It was actually my best-selling book. In fact, when the year it came out, it was picked as one of the top 20 business books in the world. Okay? And here are a variety of the delusions that organizations will have. One is we already have a great plan, but they may not know how they're actually going to make it happen. We're number one. We are the number one organization. Maybe we were, but are we still? We own the market. The market will just buy whatever we produce. Will they? Have they? Maybe they did once, but maybe not anymore. Certainly the car companies found that out. Okay? We've already changed. When people say they've already changed, I usually ask them, okay, what did you stop? Because you haven't stopped doing anything, you haven't changed. We know the right way. We just need one big win. I refer that to the purple rhino syndrome. So people go hunting these purple rhinos that are very rare. They're $200 million contracts to produce something. While they're hunting the purple rhinos, the lesser rhinos can wander through the village and no one pays attention to them because they're looking for the purple rhino. Okay? But what you really need is frequent small wins and occasional big wins, not just big wins. We have consensus. Everybody agrees. We have the ducks lined up. That's not natural. Ducks don't normally want to walk in a line together. So you have to deal with the fact that ducks get misaligned. We have the necessary processes. We already know how to make this happen. We just have to execute. This is a classic. We just have to execute. Okay? We've got this great strategy now. We just have to do it. The word just has to be banned in that context because execution is hard. Execution is very, very difficult. The biggest reason strategic plans fail is because they aren't executed. The second reason, by the way, the strategic plans fail is because the incentive and reward system is not aligned with the new directions of the organization. So just executing is not easy at all, and the word just should be deleted. We found it was easy. If that's the case, you didn't do it. It's going to be hard. And we succeeded as we planned. That's very rare that you actually succeed as you plan. If you're paying attention to the marketplace, if you're paying attention to your stakeholders and other constituencies, you will learn that the way to success is somewhat different than what you originally envisioned. Now, we took these delusions and a whole bunch of questions we designed around these illusions, and we could have people answer these questions with an online tool, with a computer-based tool. And so in this company, in this case, its biggest delusions were that it had great plans, that it had already changed, that we have consensus, we just have to make the numbers, and we just have to execute. And we'd use this diagnostic tool to start a discussion with the leaders in the company about why these things were delusions and why that might be leading them astray. And those conversations were often quite fruitful. Now, one other model. Sometimes I ran into problems where people have these strategic disputes. They're not sure how to deal with environmental issues. They're not sure how to deal with big changes in the market. They're not sure how to deal with major changes in the organization. And so they have these debates and they disagree. But it often has struck me that they aren't actually disagreeing about the elements of the strategy, that there's a deeper source of those disagreements. And that led to this model. So people make decisions, and they make it based on their perceptions of different information and knowledge. So it's their perceptions of the information and knowledge, and of course where they choose to seek it. They have needs and beliefs that affect those perceptions and the sources they use. These needs and beliefs come from both nature and nurture, say training, for example. So people in the environment, they didn't want to believe that their environmental toxic chemicals were the threat they were, because it would force them to make different investment decisions. Okay? So we needed to go down deeper and understand their needs and beliefs about the environment. The people who are looking changing markets, say from defense electronics to commercial electronics, we need to understand their needs and beliefs about expertise and innovation in technology and how that differs in different markets, because that was what was holding them back. The people adopting major organizational changes, total quality management, had disagreements about needs and beliefs about what quality management meant, how you implement it, how you knew you were doing it. And only by exploring the needs and beliefs were we able to really understand why the strategy conflicts were emerging and then be able to remediate that. So we've come a long way in these 5 lectures. The first lecture we worried about how to make choices under certainty. So we had alternatives that had attributes, say X and Y, and you were sure if you bought an alternative you got a value of X and Y, but what you weren't sure was the trade-off between those two. And we spent that lecture dealing with that. The second lecture we added uncertainty. In this case, just uncertainty about money. And we talked about how we could use utility theory to reflect your risk attitude and incorporate that into making a decision. The third lecture, we added multiple attributes. So it wasn't just money, it was other things. It was the benefits of spending money, for example. And we could trade off benefits versus costs, for instance. Then we added multiple decision makers, and we learned from Ken Arrow the impossibility of having a perfect decision rule. And we used our benevolent dictator approach to where the dictator has preferences about your preferences, not preferences on his or her own. Then the fourth lecture, we focused on another approach to dealing with uncertainty. We broke it down into stages so you could address different aspects of the uncertainty initially, say the technical uncertainty and later the market uncertainty. And we used real options to represent that. Then in this lecture, we went away from the formal methods, and we basically looked at empirical results. What do we know about human decision making? And we focused on when should you use lectures 1 through 4 and when should you use lecture 5. And basically in unfamiliar situations that you infrequently or never have faced that have high consequences, lectures 1 through 4 give you the methods and tools to address them. And all other things in life, lecture 5 is the right place to go. So that's it for value-centered decision making. Thank you very much.